Ruth Reichl, it's great to see you, and thanks for spending some time with us today. I appreciate your making the time.
Happy to be here.
And the reason that I wanted to get on your calendar and have a conversation with you during this pandemic is because you have a really interesting piece of the puzzle, the history of performing arts at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And that is that, as you will recall, the museum has a long history of presenting concerts over a century, a wide range of chamber music and classical music, and quite a legacy, unprecedented in museums in the United States. And then there's this period in the 1930s and 40s where in my historical research, there is a woman who was co-producing concerts with the Cleveland Museum of Art at a very, very high level, but I can never figure out precisely who she is or how she fits into the framework of our staff of curators over time. Unrelated to all of that, I was reading your memoir, the one that's entitled For You, Mom, Finally. And you are describing your relationship with your grandmother in this book. And this is one and the same person. This is Mollie Brudno. So I ask you, who was Mollie Brudno, and what a remarkable thing to discover that that you are carrying the legacy of this remarkable woman.
She was remarkable, and especially remarkable for her time. She was a doer in every way. She was also, I should say, very connected to Cleveland. I mean, really loved Cleveland. She was very civic-minded. And I mean, her own story, which it's a story I love because it's such a woman's story. She was a very gifted pianist. And she was from a large family of eight. There were 8 siblings, and only the youngest was a male. And my grandmother got a scholarship to go to a conservatory in Switzerland. And her parents wouldn't let her take this scholarship because she had to go to work so she could put her brother through medical school.
Wow.
And there's a twist to that, which is that while she was working and putting her brother through medical school, she fell madly in love with a man in Cleveland, and he wouldn't marry her because she was so poor. And after her brother Will graduated from medical school and went into practice, he ended up marrying the sister of the guy who wouldn't marry my grandmother. And I mean, it's such a story about women being thwarted in their ambitions, with this, ironic twist of her then being jilted by this guy. And my mother said she never forgave her brother for marrying this woman, but she went on to marry my grandfather, who was a doctor who, oddly, although they were Jewish, he worked at the Catholic hospital in Cleveland. He worked at St. Anne's, which I don't believe exists anymore. But
yeah, when I discovered started to put all these pieces together is because in this legacy of extraordinary concerts organized and presented by the Cleveland Museum of Art in the period of the 1930s into the early 50s, all these programs emerge with Mollie Brudno's name on them. She was not employed by the Cleveland Museum of Art, but here she is presenting major artists in Cleveland at a time where this was high culture and just internationally renowned artists. And the list is staggering, from Vladimir Horowitz, Rudolf Serkin, Arthur Rubinstein, great performers in the world of dance, Martha Graham, Devi Jha, Uday Shankar, who was here in the early 1930s, and whose youngest brother was in his dance ensemble. That was a teenager named Ravi Shankar, making his first trips to the United States. Jascha Heifetz, the list goes on that your grandmother was producing. So somewhere she managed to find herself at the top of a professional career, an impresario, working in the performing arts in Cleveland. Do you know anything about how that came to be?
yeah, she So she marries my grandfather. They have a normal life, and then the Depression comes along. And it was one of the few times when women of her social class were actually allowed to work. And she went to work. She first worked for NBC as the Cleveland manager, and I don't know what she was doing there. But when the war comes along and all the men go off to war, my grandmother becomes the representative of Saul Hurok in Cleveland. And she, she had extraordinary musical taste, and she also had very Catholic tastes. I mean, she brought everyone, Paul Robeson. They were very friendly with Fritz Chrysler. It's like all these names which sort of like, floated through my childhood. And she not only brought them to Cleveland, but she often put them up in her home. And so my mother, grew up around all these people, knowing these people. I mean, Bertrand Russell came and stayed with them, and she did a lecture series. Clarence Darrow came and stayed, and I have a letter from Clarence Darrow saying how much he loved this family, that he thought that, my grandmother's family was, one of the most intellectually interesting families he had met in America.
You were not raised in Cleveland yourself, were you? So how does your consciousness of your grandmother and her Cleveland world come to you?
Well, my mother was very proud of her mother, and we went and visited them in Cleveland all the time, but my mother talked about her mother all the time. I mean, my mother was then of the generation of women who basically were not allowed to work because the men came home from the war and women were supposed to leave the work world. And my mother was very frustrated at not being able to work. And she was always sort of holding up my grandmother as having had this fantastic career.
Yeah. And when I put two and two together and I'd come across your grandmother's name in my reading of your own work, I have to tell the story again because I've told it a few times. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I emailed you a little bit out of the blue through your website and said, I'm a longtime admirer of your food writing, big fan, but I actually want to talk to you about your grandmother. And I think my phone rang 10 minutes after I sent that email. And it was something along the lines of, who are you and why are you asking me about my grandmother? And it's this Cleveland connection. Did you travel out here as a kid? Did you spend time in Cleveland?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, I am the child of older parents. So my mother was over 40 when I was born. And so my grandparents were old, to me anyway, as a child. I mean, they were these very old people. And by then my grandfather had given up his practice, and they lived at the Wade Park Manor, which was a hotel, and he was a hotel doctor. And so we would go and stay in what I then thought was a fabulous place. I don't know if it really was, but I have these great memories of going there. And of course, there was always music, and we were always going off to see something. I mean, throughout her life, music was just enormously important to my grandmother.
Yeah, she occupies, as far as I can tell, a kind of a major chapter in the cultural life of history of Cleveland through mostly classical music, but also dance and lectures and theater actors, but is not a household name, I don't know right now, but we're going to change that by kind of getting this on the record and memorializing her.
Well, my mother always felt like my grandmother never quite got her due. So, when you wrote to me, I was like, yes, I want to do anything I can to, put forward. I mean, mostly just because as a woman, I'm so proud of what she did. And it was so unusual. I mean, if she had been a man, you wouldn't think twice about it. But she was very capable. She was very bright. And she was extremely charming.
And what came out of this from our point of view is that your generosity was that you happen to have, I think you said at the time, it was a valise, a case full of these beautiful photographs, all these gorgeous sepia tone photographs, most of them signed for your grandmother. Thank you, had a wonderful time in Cleveland, best wishes, this kind of thing.
Well, I mean, that would be typical of my grandmother, that I don't think anybody came through that she didn't ask them to please sign a photograph for her. And my mother kept them very proudly. I mean, I just, remember that there was this sort of lacquered wooden box filled with these photographs. And my mother always said they were very precious. And I was like, I don't know why they're precious, but so, when you came along, I thought, here's something I can do with these. I don't know what to do with them.
They are precious, and they're now well taken care of by our archives department, who have made them available on the web for all to see. Researchers or fans alike can find them. And this conversation will help us further annotate what we have, and your family's contribution to the archives. So I'm grateful for that. It's really great to have this almost 150 photographs, I think, from which was probably just a fraction of the work she did over those many years.
Yeah, I'm sure it's just a fraction. I mean,
Yeah.
um, and I have a few letters, and I have to admit, I kept a couple of the pictures that I
What?
I really wanted the Paul Robeson one, so I kept that one.
Right, of course, yeah. We're in this unprecedented and really difficult time of being at home, and everyone's being creative and productive and hopefully fruitful at home. Um, and of course, you've had your own extremely active and successful career. What are you doing in this time at home?
Well, it hit me when this all started that I didn't know where the food landscape was going to end up, but that it was never going to be the same at the end of this, that this was showing up how really broken our food system has been. And that either we would fix it in this moment, or 40 years of work on sustainability would go out the window, and we would end up with an even more industrialized food supply. And I decided that I really wanted to keep a record. When we come out the other side, I want to know how we got wherever we're going. And so I've spent the last 4 months, I started in March, Zooming every day with chefs and farmers and fishermen and all kinds of food policy people and wholesalers, anyone I could think of who wanted to talk about what this is doing to their business, where they think it's going. Then Black Lives Matter started, and that we took a turn into that as well. And it's been amazing because in 4 months, things have changed literally every day,
Right.
and things continue to change. But I think, we're going to see a lot of farm failure, really frightening what's happening to farmers in this moment. And certainly we're going to lose, I would guess, at least a third of our independent restaurants, maybe more. The use of enormous amounts of fertilizer, of pesticides. Farming changed dramatically. Going into the war, a quarter of America was engaged in farming. By 1960, only 9%, and now I think it's down to something like 3%. I mean, it used to be, in my grandmother's time, everybody knew someone who was a farmer. I mean, everybody had a connection to farming in some way. Today, almost nobody does. I mean, our food supply is sort of mysterious. You go to the supermarket and you order online, and this stuff arrives, but you don't really know where it came from.
Your grandma and grandfather lived in a time where civic life was probably totally different than it is now. You mentioned that at that time, someone knew a farmer. They probably went to a butcher shop and had an idea of where food was coming from and how a city functioned. It's different now, I think.
I think it's very different. And I think people had a sense of civic duty in a way that is quite different now. I mean, today, if you have a sense of civic duty, maybe you run for office. Back then, I think there were lots of ways that people really thought about their community. And I know my grandparents did. I know Cleveland was enormously important to both of them. And they really wanted to be part of the life of that community. And they thought of themselves as part of the community in a way that, we all travel so much these days. I mean, people aren't rooted in that way. But, I mean, my grandmother was, part of the League of Women Voters, and um, she really thought when she started her business, what she thought was, I am going to bring music to my community because they deserve it.
Yeah.
And this is how I'm going to, do my bit to make Cleveland a better place to live.
It's just a crucial point. It's not just work and business, it's a contribution to the fabric of the city life, which is why discovering her body of work and the programs and the legacy of what she did was a huge eye-opener for me over a long period of time too. She produced a lot of concerts over many years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on behalf of the museum, and I suppose all of Cleveland, we're grateful to know it, and thanks to your grandma for being a major force.
Yeah, well, and
Yeah.
she would have liked to have thought of herself as a major force. I mean, it was important to her.